Attention in the terminal. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, today's excursion into transportation excellence. I'm your conductor, Phil Bell, coming to you from the E. Hunter Harrison Chair at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And as always, I am behind this. Happy to be back behind the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So all aboard as we discuss Amtrak and traveling for Christmas. And I know what some of you are going to say. You're going to say, Phil, look, Christmas is over. It's New Year's Eve. Why are you one of these people that insists on keeping Christmas going? Well, I got to tell you, the reality is I'm a 12 Days of Christmas guy simply because, A, I love it. It's one of my favorite times of the year, hence the red, Christmas red that I'm still wearing, but also because we have such a big build up to Christmas, the traveling, the gifts, the you name it. And so, hey, why not enjoy it for more than just a single day? And also because the Christmas season is one of the times that I enjoy the most because of the travel, and that's specifically traveling by train. And I've had an opportunity to do it many, many years in several different epochs of Amtrak's existence. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that as we go forward. Now, just a few things. First of all, thanks to Gary B. Gary, great email. Thank you so much for listening and the commentary you have. As always, to everybody out there, if you send me an email, info, I-N-F-O, at allaboard.media, I will respond to you. I'd love to have conversations both offline, and if you're interested, we can come have you on and talk about trains here on the All Aboard podcast. And number 2, we want to announce some really cool things that are coming for 2024. Starting on Monday, Money Day, tomorrow, New Year's Day, we will start our new podcast schedule. So that will mean you will get new episodes from me on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then the first Thursday of every month will be Train Book Thursday. And that's when we will do a video and audio. Of course, we have both here. Review of a train book. And so what I want to do is talk about everything from some of the great Morning Sun style books to some of the more in-depth discussions of rail history and the like. So everything we talk about here on the podcast, but we also want to make sure that we're promoting what some of the other great rail folks out there are doing. And I also want to do a little quick recap of what has been happening to All Things Trains and our parent company, All Aboard Media, in 2023. So first of all, thanks to everybody who has subscribed, who has watched, who has commented, who has liked, who loves us, who hates us, all of you. You made it a great year. And this has been a year of a lot of change for us. First of all, we got our new name, All Aboard Media, being the parent company. It was originally, for those who may have been with us since the very, very beginning, the Montview Publishing Company, named after Norfolk Southern's Montview Yard in Lynchburg, Virginia. But then I said, hey, wait a second. We really need something that just kind of is national and worldwide. And what is the name that everybody thinks of, or one of the things that everybody thinks of when they hear trains? It's the conductor saying, all aboard, to get people on board and know it's time to go. So that's the name of our parent company. And a big thanks to my good friend Dan C. out there for coming up with the name All Things Trains. That has been great for focusing and making sure people know what we're all about and what you can find when you come here. So thank you all for being a part of it. One of the what I would say is probably the best feel-good story of 2023 to me has been CSX's Heritage Units. I know a lot of you are big Heritage Units fans, as I am, and so it was really neat to see them put out a very interesting program, which I love. I know a lot of people are critical of it, but I love it. I love the way that you have the front of the locomotive being the current CSX scheme fading into the back, or, depending on how you look at it, the past fading into the present. It's a great way to me to showcase all of the railroads that have gone into CSX, but also to do it in a different way. And so Union Pacific, for example, they have stylized schemes of the original paint schemes of the railroads that are components of UP, whereas Norfolk Southern went out and painted the entire locomotive. Amtrak has done a slight variation. They've done the original schemes, but they've also added additional graphics on the side. And Metro North has done the original schemes, but where they had an opportunity to do a different take. So a good example there is Conrail with the yellow nose that was used on the FL9s for both Conrail and also some of the Penn Central services that operated there. So kudos to CSX. To me, that is the best feel-good story, railroad story of 2023. Obviously, the worst story of 2023 was the Norfolk Southern East Palestine wreck. And I don't really want to bring that up because it was a difficult time for not only that railroad, but our industry overall. But I was very glad to see the way Norfolk Southern handled it. I know that every company is going to go through its ups and downs, but when they had this down, you saw a lot of what made Norfolk Southern and its predecessors, Norfolk and Western, Southern Railway, Conrail, and otherwise be such great railroads in that they handled that situation very, very deftly. When the disaster happened, they knew how to clean it up. They had an established plan, which they executed, even though that plan was not fully understood by the media or the public at large. They did that. They saved lives. They saved property in that process. And then, even though they took a lot of big hits in the media and from politicians, they stuck with it. They worked hard. They did what it took to make things right in East Palestine. And so we got to give a lot of kudos to Norfolk Southern for how they handled it, even if times seemed rather dark. And it was certainly a dark time for railroading in 2023. And my favorite story, my favorite, absolute favorite story of 2023 comes to us from one of my home states, New Jersey. I have several. I've got Virginia, I've got Florida, you name it. But my favorite is still New Jersey because of the great railroading there and all the great memories. And that is Ricardo the Bull. I know you all heard about Ricardo. I think we talked about it on an earlier episode. But Ricardo, for those who didn't, that was a bull that escaped maybe from a slaughterhouse and ended up on the tracks in Newark Penn Station. Now, if you've been in the area of Newark Penn Station, you know it's a heavily industrial area. There's nothing that looks even remotely agricultural anywhere nearby. And suddenly, New Jersey Transit says, look, our trains are delayed for 40 minutes. Why? There's a bull on the tracks. And there's even some video if you go out there to X, formerly known as Twitter, and some of the other social sites, you can see Ricardo prancing around down on the track and so forth. And New Jersey Transit has capitalized on it by having a plush version of Ricardo for sale. And luckily, he will not be slaughtered. He was actually taken out to a nature preserve in western New Jersey, northwestern New Jersey, because as you know, we love North Jersey here at the All Aboard podcast. And, but we love you folks in South Jersey who like us too. But Ricardo is still alive. He's still with us. And I think he is the favorite rail fan and favorite railroad story of 2023. And one more thing before we move on, I also want to point out that today is somewhat of a sad day because it means that Montana Rail Link is operating its last trains. Montana Rail Link has been a very, very good and important part of the rail industry and the North American Rail Network since it was founded in the 1980s by spinning off part of Burlington Northern's former Northern Pacific Main Line across North Dakota and Montana. And, you know, it was just so good to see everything that they were able to accomplish, not only by reinvigorating a part of the rail network that not so much had fallen into decline, but certainly wasn't key to Burlington Northern's plans in that day, and making it an exciting railroad that grew its own traffic. They had substantial traffic on branches in addition to the main line, and they also helped to grow the Burlington Northern and then BNSF, because a few years later, BN looked back and said, well, wait a second, this line is still critical to us. So they started running a lot of through trains over MRL, which helped grow that business and made it truly a world-class railroad. So kudos to Dennis Washington, Bill Brodsky, and everybody who has been a part of that operation for, I believe it's now 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 5 decades. Think about that. 5 decades of operation. That's to be commended. And so we're sad to see those blue, black, and white diesels going away, but we're excited to see what's going to come next. And we wish the BNSF the best of luck as they take that carrier over. Now, to move on to the main event. And the main event here is, as you see on the title, it is Ranting and Reminiscing about Amtrak. And Amtrak is very contentious because Number one, it is the primary passenger rail operator in the United States. So as a result, because it's a passenger rail operator, it interacts with so many people, thousands of people each year, and so therefore it's going to have its lovers and it's going to have its haters. If you talk to me, you're going to have to count me in somewhere closer to the hater category, because I am not a big fan of the idea of state-sponsored rail transportation overall, and that's simply because I'm a free market guy. I don't think that the government should be involved in anything. And frankly, I think the track record shows that the government is not very good at providing any of these services to start with. And you don't even need a scientist or a study to show that. I'd say just talk to a combination of rail passengers and rail advocates, and anyone who has traveled on Amtrak over its 50 plus years of operation will know that the service is very inconsistent. You know that it typically doesn't go where a lot of people want it to go. It has very difficult relationships with its host railroads most of the time. It has never made a profit. It continues to look to politicians that by and large are, about as interested in them as Cindy Crawford is interested in me, in order to keep it operating. And it is very, very difficult for the public, for advocates, for potential partners, or otherwise to work with Amtrak. So, you put all those things together, I'm not a big fan. However, I do recognize that Amtrak is here. They are operating the trains. They are worth talking about in this forum. And also, I got to ride the trains. So as long as they're operating them, I'm probably going to be there, even though I wish it was something different. But going into a little bit of the history here, Amtrak began operating on May 1st, 1971. That was an important change in the way that our rail service overall was provided, because this was the first time when you could see the federal government really getting involved in a hands-on way with the provision of just transportation in general outside of the mails. So Amtrak, now let's be clear, at that point it didn't actually operate its own trains. It was funding and marketing the trains, which were continue to be operated by a lot of its host railroads. And the way Amtrak was set up, you had a lot of central planners get together and decide, well, let's go ahead and take this route, let's go ahead and take that route, let's avoid this route, and let's forget the other. Now, in some ways, you could certainly understand that's the way any kind of a planning effort would go. But what Amtrak failed to do, and one of the things that rankles me about it, is that they did so without recognizing a lot of the traditional traffic patterns that drove the development of the rail passenger trains that they were here to save. And if you want a little bit of perspective, look at where the railroads go. The railroads they follow paths that were laid down by the settlers who were traveling in a previous generation, the farmers, the agricultural, the people who were building cities and had to get from one city to the other. So following stagecoach routes, following ancient Indian routes and otherwise, that's where the railroad tracks came from. That's where our highways came from. And then you had from that spring the desire to say, hey, well, look, if people are already going from point A to point B on the stagecoach, if they're going from point A to point B walking, well, let's provide a train to get them there faster. And voila, you had your passenger trains. Small affairs at first, but certainly grew. And there was a lot of optimism for the American passenger train in the post-World War II era. And that's because before World War II, rail passenger trains were declining. So sadly, a lot of the 20th century was talking about rail passenger decline, and pre-World War II, heavy decline. During World War II, you had an era when people absolutely were traveling by train because it was very difficult to purchase private automobiles, and a lot of the efforts to improve the highway transportation network had not yet taken place. So therefore, you had a lot of people on trains. And let's remember, a lot of these people were also your military folks. So they had to travel to their installations, they had to travel to basic training, they had to travel home. So a lot of them were riding the rails. And so we've heard a lot of stories. We know about the troop sleepers and the funky trucks, and it'll come to me the Allied full cushion trucks that were on the troop sleepers that were very, very uncomfortable, and probably the opposite of being full cushion from what I understand of people who actually had to ride on them. Certainly a time when railroads looked over and said, hey, this is going to help us succeed. And they wanted to capture that business. And they did by introducing a lot of the streamlined passenger cars that we still see today, whether it's on as private rail cars, on Via Rail, they're Canadian, and a lot of the other services they have, and also in a lot of tourist fleets now. Those cars built by Budd, Pullman Standard, American Car and Foundry were definitely a major revolution over what had previously existed, and they reflected the desire of rail bosses to keep a lot of those folks who traveled during World War II on the trains. And often, actually in most cases, they were being pulled by not steam engines, but being pulled by the colorful diesel engines that were introduced by Electromotive Division, Alco, Baldwin. So you think about, my favorite, you look back there, you see me with the let's make sure we get it right. You see me with an E8 up here in the corner, Erie 833 or Erie Lackawanna 833, as we like to say here. Colorful diesels like that certainly were more economical to operate than the steam locomotives, and also gave the American passenger train a look and a vibe that very much fit an optimistic time period in the 1950s. Unfortunately, it was so fleeting, you almost missed it if you blinked. A great example is the Chesapeake in Ohio and its chassis. The chassis never operated because by the time the cars had been delivered, it was already very apparent to the C&O management that they were not going to be consistently profitable operating this train, and that the crowds were deserting the trains for road and air. And that brings us to another problem. Railroads, as we talk about on almost every episode of the All Aboard podcast, were taxed heavily on their profits as well, but property. And so when you go back and look at some of the areas where passenger train service used to be heavy, great example is North Jersey. Also look at New York City, Boston, Chicago. You had a lot of trains coming in, you had a lot of yard area, you had a lot of property that was on the tax rolls, and those municipalities didn't look at it the way that some might today. One of the few times when today's governments might actually have been better than the governments of yesteryear, but a lot of those municipalities looked at that as being an absolute cash cow. And so there was no way they were going to say, okay, well, look, I understand that you're providing me X amount of value in terms of being able to move people back and forth, and therefore we're going to rebate some of that value or adjust the way property taxes are made to make sure that you can continue to provide those services that are so critical to the people in our community. No. They didn't do that. They said, we are absolutely going to sock you in every way possible and make it very difficult for you to operate. And then at the same time, hope that you continue to operate the service with the understanding that, especially as it goes to interstate service, the Interstate Commerce Commission is going to stand there and do whatever it took to keep the trains running, no matter how few people were riding them. So that is a lot of the environment that the railroads were operating the passenger trains in, even in the optimistic decade of the 1950s. And so you saw some of the early train-offs. The Dixie Flagler, for example, one of the 3 trains operating between Chicago and Florida on a tri-weekly basis. You had the Dixie Flagler, you had the South Wind. The Dixie Flagler was the Florida East Coast Railways train, the South Wind was the Pennsylvania Railroads train, and the City of Miami was the Illinois Central's train. And you had all 3 of those operating on alternate days, so you had daily service between the endpoints, but then you had operating over different routes in between on each given day. Dixie Flagler was the first train to expire. It lost its name, it had its route cut back, and ultimately it became just another faceless accommodation train that didn't go all the way between Chicago and Miami. And so that was an early example of the decline that started. Other railroads like the Lehigh Valley in the early 1960s totally abandoned their passenger service when allowed to by the Interstate Commerce Commission. This continued in a very, very hectic pace, and one of the big episodes was the effort to discontinue the California Zephyr. The Silver Lady, one of the newest streamlined passenger trains, which, if I remember correctly, started operating in 1949. Well, by the late 1960s, the Western Pacific said, we want to pull the plug, And this was a major case before the Interstate Commerce Commission that didn't want to let them do it, in large part because a relatively small number of the people who can, a small number of the small number of people that continued to ride the train continued to say, hey, please let it stay. And look, in my heart, I want to let it stay too. I want it to continue running. I want it to be here today, but the economics didn't justify it at the time. And I want to give you a good example of what that means. Now, think about the route of the California Zephyr, the original California Zephyr, not today's Amtrak Zephyr, but the original California Zephyr operated between Chicago and Oakland. It used the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy between Chicago and Denver. So through Omaha, Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska to Denver. Now you have several crew districts on that. You actually had more in those days than you do now. Then it operated over the Rio Grande, Denver, Rio Grande, and Western, or Rio Grande, depending on how you pronounce it, between Denver and Salt Lake City. Again, several crew districts there. Once you get to Salt Lake City, traveling the Western Pacific to Oakland. Again, several different crew districts. So you have multiple crews, and when we talk about crews and crew districts, we're talking about the train crew. So the engineer, the conductor, the fireman, the brakeman or brakeman or brakemen, depending on what the various union contracts required for that train. You had all of those different groups who would get on and get off and operate the train for different segments of its journey. By contrast, if I put this, in some cases, the same number of passengers, which is part of the problem with the decline, or even a smaller number of passengers on a Boeing 707, the early Boeing 707s had a 4-man cockpit crew. So the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the flight engineer. That 4-man crew can get those passengers between Chicago and San Francisco, Oakland obviously being outside of San Francisco, where the California Zephyr had its western terminus, and passengers could then take a ferry across to San Francisco itself. Those 4 men could fly a plane of passengers to Oakland and then back at several times. Now, granted, they couldn't actually do it with that one crew because of hours of service, but you probably could get at least 2 turns in a day. So one group of passengers going to Oakland, another group of passengers coming back before that crew finishes their day, long before the California Zephyr itself even makes it to Denver. So when you look at that in terms of economics, it's very easy to see why so many people involved in the allocation of capital, and that's people buying stocks and bonds, were taking their money out of railroads and putting it into other businesses, including airlines and otherwise. And before you liberals, because I know you liberals are out there and you're probably saying, Phil, you are just giving a great example of why private profit is terrible and blah, 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 blah. Well, here's the reality. All of us are involved in the market process. Every one of us. If you have purchased stock, if you have mutual funds or otherwise, you are part of the marketplace. And many of the people who were buying stock in those days simply said, hey, you know what? We just can't do it. We just can't do it, and we don't want to put our money someplace where we're not going to earn any kind of a return. And it's critical, absolutely critical, and I think I propound this every time we have an episode, that railroads be able to raise money, because unfortunately, our business is not one like big tech, where you can simply build something and let it scale. Railroads, rail equipment, property and otherwise requires constant expensive maintenance. Therefore, railroads are always going to the capital markets, even when they do well, to make sure that they are able to provide the service that's necessary. Not only that you, the passenger, want, but also what the freight customer needs. It's critical. And so when you're looking at an era where passenger service at best is marginally profitable and at worst is a black financial, or I should say a red financial hole, because obviously red ink, and losses. Red ink is typically associated with losses. That is what the railroads were up against and why they were so adamant about getting rid of passenger service. And this is what led to the creation of Amtrak and its inauguration in 1971. Now, why did I go through this long explanation of what Amtrak was? It's because Amtrak is how I've traveled for my entire life when it comes to taking passenger trains. Never had the opportunity, wasn't born early enough to enjoy the era of private passenger rail. For that, I gotta say, Mom, what were you thinking? Come on, didn't you know? But she was born in 1949, so she would have been 21 by the time, or she was 21, I should say, by the time Amtrak was created. So, even if I was born a little bit earlier, probably wouldn't have gotten to see very much of it. So that means that traveling at Christmas and everything that I did ended up being on Amtrak. And I'll tell you, for all the fact that I'm not that big a fan of the way things were done, I absolutely loved traveling that way, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, because it was such a magical and a special time. The president of Amtrak at the time was W. Graham Claytor Jr., and Graham Claytor had come from the Southern Railway. And he was a very interesting character because on one hand, he absolutely loved trains. He and his brother, Bob Claytor, they were big rail fans. In fact, in today's lexicon, we probably call them foamers, the way that everybody calls me a foamer. But they loved trains. They both got into the rail industry. Bob Claytor with the N&W, Graham Claytor ultimately with the Southern. And what they did is, in their respective railroads, tried to do everything as best they can. And the greatest example comes from the Southern when Graham Claytor was there, and he decided to stay out of Amtrak and continue to operate the Southern Railway's trains, most notably the Southern Crescent, which was the old Southerner renamed and operating between New York and New Orleans. And he didn't just throw a new name on it and say a bunch of nice things. No. They repainted the E8s in the 1950s era, green, gold, and aluminum. Aluminum is white, but the paint color is called aluminum, so that's what we call it here at the All Aboard podcast, and really gave it a great show for the time that he was there and into his successor, Stanley Crane's time as well. So the Southern Crest continued to operate. Graham Claytor proved himself to be a very good passenger guy, even though he was also known as being the attack dog for Bill Brosnan when they were trying to get rid of the passenger trains on the Central of Georgia and also the Southern itself. So it's very interesting. For a guy who loved trains, he also exhibited, or I should say exemplified, his legal training when he did what his boss, Bill Brosnan, wanted him to do, which was just get rid of trains, truncated the Royal Palm, which at one point operated between Cincinnati and Jacksonville, in a swamp which was jokingly referred to as West Jockstrap, Georgia, because it was absolutely nowhere, simply to discourage people from riding it. But not long after, when he was in charge in the engineer's seat, he was making sure that Southern Railway's trains were great again, and we really do applaud him for that. And his time at Amtrak, to me, as a young man, was no different. I love seeing the long consists they had on the Florida trains, the matching red, white, and blue Phase 3 stripes, the employees who were very enthusiastic and helpful. All kinds of things were much better in the Claytor era and made that probably the pinnacle of Amtrak's existence to this point. And so that gives you an idea of what I was riding and the era. But let me give you a little overview of what it was like to travel from Tallahassee, Florida, where I was living, to Newark, New Jersey, which was the closest stop to my family in Hackensack, New Jersey, and how we would travel at Christmas. Now, here is what we would start our journey with. Wait, you're saying, Phil, but it's not a train. This is a train podcast. What's going on? You're right. It's not a train. That's a Greyhound Lines Motor Coach Industries 102A3 bus, 102 inches wide, hence the 102 in its designation. And that is an example of what Greyhound looked like in the 80s with their American flag, Pepsi can type paint scheme. And that's because in those days, just like that now at the end of 2023, Amtrak did not serve Tallahassee. when Amtrak was created, it, as I mentioned earlier, had its central planners, went around and decided we're going to take this route, we're going to take that route, and so on. But one route they did not take that seemingly would be critically important because it served a state capital was the Gulf Wind. And let me find you a photo, if I can, of the Gulf Wind itself. This train operated between New Orleans and Jacksonville on the Louisville and Nashville, between New Orleans and Chattahoochee, Florida, and then went over to the Seaboard Airline originally, and later on the Seaboard Coastline at Chattahoochee for the trek into Jacksonville. And there it would go to Jacksonville Terminal, and the Jacksonville Terminal, Jacksonville Union Station complex, where passengers could change for a variety of trains north and south, whether it's on the Florida East Coast to points along the coast to Miami in that direction, on the Atlantic coastline down south in several ways, whether it's via Orlando or via Leesburg toward Tampa, St. Petersburg, Fort Myers, Naples, and so on, or the Seaboard Seaboard Airline to Miami, as well as Fort Myers, Naples, Tampa, and St. Petersburg, or head north into Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, you name it. So the Gulf Wind was a critically important train, and we're not sure why Amtrak decided not to take it over in the first place. Again, because Amtrak was a, then as now, government-funded agency, and Tallahassee is the state capital of Florida, and one of Florida's long-serving senators, George Smathers, was heavily involved in rail transportation and trying to solve a lot of the problems that were in the rail industry. So Florida was a critically important place, yet they didn't take over the Gulf Wind. That meant when I rode my first train, which was in 1984, we did not board, as I said, at the train station in Tallahassee. I want to give you a little picture of that. Oh man, it looks like I messed up our slideshow there. Hold on, let me get the right thing for you. Make sure we pause it. And our train here. And by the way, this is some of what comes from being a railroad guy and a highly trained rail enthusiast, but perhaps not quite a highly trained broadcast specialist as Rush Limbaugh was, who obviously, if you've been listening to the All Things Trains, All Aboard podcast for any length of time, you know I'm a big fan of Rush Limbaugh. That right there is where our trip to New Jersey from Tallahassee would start, which is a Greyhound bus station on Tennessee Street in Tallahassee, Florida. And I got a little funny story about this. So for a while, I went to private school in Tallahassee at McClay School, and one of my classmates, his name was Mitch Titsey. And Mitch was a little bit of a annoying guy, kind of like me. So I am actually a big fan of Mitch, but as a kid, I always thought he was a little bit annoying, and he was annoying me one day, and he said, "My dad owns a Greyhound bus station in town." And I said, "There is no way your dad owns the Greyhound bus station, because clearly Greyhound owns the Greyhound bus station." Well, in reality, his father did, because the Greyhound bus station, even though it looks like a pretty substantial installation for Greyhound, has never been, at least as far as I know, owned by Greyhound, and it's currently owned by an attorney who resides in Tallahassee. It was a large, substantial agency that they rented from the owner, who in that period was my classmate's father, Mitch Titsey, who also owned the Village Inns in town, where I love to go and eat cheese grits with a lot of cheese. That's where I cultivated this incredible Hulk figure that I know Taylor Swift and Cindy Crawford, when y'all see this podcast, you're going to come for. Anyway, we would start here at the Tallahassee bus station, and we would travel to Jacksonville, because Jacksonville was the nearest location where we could board, and it was usually my grandmother and I traveling, especially at Christmas time, where we could board Amtrak, and we would do that here at the Amtrak Clifford Lane station in Jacksonville, which is north of town and near the airport. Now, the Clifford Lane station opened in the 1970s because, as happened with many Amtrak big city terminals, the company looked out and said, "Hey, look, you know what? We don't operate anywhere near the volume of service that used to be provided. So we're actually going to downsize. And to give you an idea of what they're downsizing from, Jacksonville Terminal and Jacksonville Union Station were together made for a very, very prominent and imposing entry into the city of Jacksonville. And that was important because Jacksonville, then as now, was really viewed as being the gateway to Florida. And if you think about it, how many people, whether they were traveling from the Northeast or traveling from the Midwest, you came to Florida by train? This is what you saw, this beautiful terminal that was and is, I should say, a showpiece of the city. But Amtrak, just as they did in cities like Cleveland, they said, look, we can't really handle this anymore. And so in the mid 1970s, they opened the station at Clifford Lane. Now, I want to give you another example, or a couple other examples of what Jacksonville Terminal was like, because nowadays you can actually visit Jacksonville Terminal, and there's a good chance some of you have had some conventions there. This is actually a former Seaboard Coastline office car that's outside of the station. In the background, you see a tower and a wall that is left over from the original Jacksonville Union Station, which was part of the Jacksonville Terminal complex. That was the first part. The terminal that I showed you earlier was built later. And that allowed them to expand the service there. So it's beautifully well kept, and it's named the Prime F. Osborne III Convention Center. And if you've been listening, you know who Prime Osborne is. He is one of the folks that joined with Tom Rice and then ultimately Hayes Watkins on the Chessie system to form CSX. Another view of Jacksonville Terminal, because I just can't get over how neat passenger rail in Florida used to be. You see some looks like E3s from the Atlantic coastline at left, and then that looks like an E7 from the Florida East Coast at right, waiting to handle passenger trains in Jacksonville. So in the pre-Amtrak era, in the pre-1963 era, before the Florida East Coast Railway went on strike, if you went to Florida by train, you were going to see something like that, and it is really, really neat. And one more, because look, hey, you're talking to Phil here. I'm a major nerd. I love all the interesting nuances of rail transportation. One more, this is a Jacksonville Terminal switcher handling Amtrak cars in the early Amtrak era at Jacksonville Terminal. And that's because a lot of large town, big city stations, such as Jacksonville Terminal, Chicago Union Station, Dearborn Station, even Cleveland Union Terminal, they had terminal companies that were separate railroads to operate these facilities. And those terminal companies were owned in different pieces by the various railroads that served the terminal. This way, you had a coordinated way to get cars switched, to get billing done, and otherwise. Now, to the regular traveler, this was largely imperceptible, except as right now you see folks out there on the platform waiting for the switcher to finish its work. But for the railroads and for those of us as rail enthusiasts and followers of the industry, it was interesting to follow those the terminal companies, such as the Jacksonville Terminal Company. And before we finish talking about the old station in Jacksonville, here's one more picture. Atlantic Coastline 1504. For many years, this reposed in the parking lot. And the parking lot, by the way, used to be where the tracks are. For many years, and it has been moved down to the U.S. Sugar Railroad, where it is supposed to be restored to operation. So whether it is 2024 or potentially 2025, we're going to get to see an example of Atlantic Coastline steam chugging on their main line, right along with an example of Florida East Coast steam on their main line. So for all the negative things that might be going on, there's a lot of great stuff happening in Florida as it goes to steam railroading, especially. So look out for that, and we'll certainly be covering that here at All Things Trains. Now, as I said, by the time you got to the Phil Bell era, you were at the Clifford Lane station of Amtrak, and for a young man like me, this was a place that was truly special. And it was special for several reasons. First of all, because in those days, Amtrak had a lot of employees that were, I should say, a lot more willing to be sociable, and helpful and the like. Now, I understand part of the reason why folks will tend to be a little more surly and down on their jobs is because it's a difficult work environment. And quite frankly, Amtrak for many years has been a difficult work environment. And that is a variety of factors, many of which we're going to get into in future episodes. But I was lucky that when I would be riding in the 1980s, almost every time after we took that bus to Jacksonville and went over by taxi cab to the Clifford Lane station, that one of the station agents, he saw that I liked trains. So every time I would go, he would be willing to stop by, chat with me, look at my trains magazines with me, tell me all of the different things that I needed to know. And I learned so much. I learned about CSX, which I didn't know about yet because most of what we saw in Tallahassee still said Seaboard System or Seaboard Coastline on it. He taught me about the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. Now I rail fan the RF&P all the time. That was my first introduction to it. Learning about the auto train and the P30CHs and everything else. It was great. And such a good relationship developed that one day when I went there, he introduced me to his family and his son. His son was about my age, and it was just truly special. And another thing that I want to point out that was permissible in those days that was not, that leads to one of the rants, since I promised you a rant, comes from here. You see where I'm taking this picture from? I'm on the platform. Well, I learned so much about trains and had an opportunity to see so much because back in these days, Amtrak was not ridiculous about allowing people to go out on the platforms when nothing else was going on. A good example comes to us from Samuel Augustus Jennings. Now, Samuel is a former Amtrak employee. He posts a lot of great things about rail, about Amtrak's history as well, and I like most of it. Candidly, Samuel, if you're out there listening, you know I've disagreed with you a little bit because you like to talk about a lot of race. I don't like to talk about race all that much. I think it's over the top, but Samuel's a great guy. He just talked about how he was kicked off the platform at the Orlando station. And I can attest to this because having just traveled by Amtrak at the Orlando station, their agents go absolutely bonkers and screaming like hyenas about how you can't be on the platform. Give me a break. First of all, we as taxpayers fund this thing that you call a railroad, Amtrak. And number two, one of the best things that you can do is allow those of us who are rail enthusiasts, who are being safe and who are promoting your operation without any charge, to be on the platforms when there's nothing else there and when there's no safety issue, because why not? Why would you not want, whether it's rail enthusiasts or members of the general public or otherwise, to see what you do, to see about the industry, to see it at work, to allow it to be part of their lives, so that when you run to Congress and ask for yet another subsidy, that you have people who are willing to stand up for you, as opposed to people who wonder, what do they do? Why are they even here? And Amtrak has been getting progressively worse about platform access as years have gone on. And a sad example comes to us from Roanoke, Virginia, which is a terrific railroad city. And the railroad, the Norfolk and Western, and then to a lesser extent, the Virginian, did so much to build up that city, which includes, by the way, Advanced Auto Parts. So for a while, there was what they called the David R. Good, and I can't remember his wife's name, but his wife was in there too, Rail Walk. And this walk was along the tracks where you could safely walk and see the trains. And it was dedicated to David Good because he was Norfolk Southern's chairman and also a native of that region. Now, Amtrak came along and they extended service to Roanoke. Wonderful. We love it. But after they did and built the platform where the rail walk used to be, they said, you know what? You can't go on that platform, and would actually send police to chase people off of it, even though they have 2 trains per day. So it's not like, hey, somebody's trying to set up a tripod while 200 people are trying to disembark and another 100 are trying to embark. No. This is just random people hanging out. No one's there. They're sitting safely, politely, watching trains go by, whether they're fans or not, and they're sending the police to throw them off. Ridiculous, absurd, an example of how Amtrak has continued to decline and continues to not fulfill its mission as America's passenger rail carrier. And if it wasn't for a sensible policy during a better management team, the Graham-Claytor era, I would not have had the opportunity to learn as much as I did, and so much of our history, our transportation history, would not have been covered by thousands of people who have been willing to do that. So Amtrak, bad job out of you. That's got to change. And I, for one, and all things train as a whole, is making it a point in 2024 to make that policy change and make customer service at Amtrak improve. It's our railroad, and we're going to change it. Now, let's go further, since I've had my rant. Departing from the Jacksonville station was a lot of fun because, just to set the stage, let me show you what things looked like, because as I mentioned earlier, we were in the Phase 3 era, and the Phase 3 era meant F40PHs. The Phase 3 era meant heritage cars. The Phase 3 era meant, relatively new Amfleet 2s. And this picture is actually one of my favorites. And by the way, I spent about 30 minutes looking for it last night, and as I found it, I noticed that there's 2 comments, and both of these comments are by none other than yours truly from way back in May of 2010. But this is what would happen. So we would normally, my grandmother and I would normally, especially in Christmas season, take the Silver Star from Jacksonville to Newark, New Jersey. And what you're seeing right now is exactly what would happen. The Tampa section of the Silver Star would arrive around 8:30 to 9, and they would park it on the track that you see in the foreground. Not the track with a train on it to the right, that's the station's track, but CSX's siding, which you see to the left. Now, that train is actually behind the photographer in this view. On the left, you see what looks like a flying set of F40PHs, and that's because it really did seem, even to me as a young person, that they were flying so fast that they would miss us and forget to stop at Jacksonville. But they really highballed it there. They would go northbound on this track, pass a switch, and then back in, so that the rear of the 92, which is a section that would come up from Miami, would couple on to the front of train number 82, which is a section that came up from Tampa. However, the baggage car would be moved around so that it would sit behind the locomotives that had come up with the Miami section. So that way you had a very clean arrangement of baggage dormitory, coaches from Miami, lounge from Miami, sleepers from Miami, diner, which originated in Miami, sleepers from Tampa, lounge from Tampa, and coaches. So for those of you who follow these trains on a daily basis now, and they look like they're at most maybe 7, 8, 9 cars long, these would actually, especially around Christmas time, go up to 20 cars, 20 plus. In fact, I remember once where it was 22 cars while we were riding during the Christmas season, those type of lengths, and it was truly a sight to behold. One of the things that I enjoyed the most about these trains, especially in the Christmas season, was the lounge car, because we would, and part of it was because the prices were a lot lower then, but also because, hey, I was a little bit of a Karen. You probably caught that from the rant, and I wanted every aspect of the rail experience I could get. So I pushed my grandmother to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the dining car. Now that I'm a little older and have to actually manage the budget, probably wouldn't do it, but in those days I did. And then in between, because I was a growing boy, we'd go to the lounge car. So when we would walk back to the lounge, you'd walk through the coaches and then open the door for the lounge. Sometimes the lounge was a Heritage Fleet car, other times it was Amfleet 2, and it depended. It was usually about 50-50 both times. The one thing that was always the same is when you walked into that lounge car, you got punched in the face with so much smoke, so much cigarette smoke, because everybody who was somebody that had a pack of cigarettes was going to smoke them, and they were smoking them in the lounge car like chimneys. It probably would have looked like a steam locomotive if they had a exhaust vent on the top of that car. But the reason why I liked it so much, and I got to be honest with you, I didn't like it that much as a kid, but what I appreciated then and now was how social it was, and how that social aspect was so much of a key to what made Amtrak passenger trains outstanding in that era. because it always seemed, whether it was the people you sat with in the diner, whether it was the people in the lounge car, the employees, or even other folks sitting with you in the coaches, people were willing to talk and socialize and so on, and you never had a trip where you were just sitting and head in a book. Certainly didn't have smartphones then, but you weren't just going to be like this the entire time. You weren't just going to look out the window the entire time. It was a trip where it was a traveling where the trip itself really mattered, and I loved it. And now we would, of course, go to the lounge car, get our food, take it back to our seat, which meant back through that punch in the face again of more smoke. But in times when we would go to the dining car, we would walk again through the lounge car, then through the sleepers. And the sleepers were always so interesting to see because you had several different types. I remember the 10-6 sleepers, the 11, I believe it was 11 double bedroom sleepers. And the most interesting, though, were the slumber coaches, the former Northern Pacific and New York Central cars that were on those runs. And I remember particularly the former Northern Pacific cars that had names with Loch Sloy, Loch Rannoch, Loch Lomond, Loch Arakig. It was really interesting because I'd never seen, what the heck's a loch? And later on, somebody told me, oh, a loch is a lake. So that's kind of one of the things that helped to broaden my mind beyond just what I had learned in school up to that point. And so a few years ago, 2019, and I went to the Illinois Railway Museum, one of the cars they had there was the Loch Sloy, and I couldn't believe it because I remembered walking through the Loch Sloy so many times on the Silver Star and the Silver Meteor in those services. It was like seeing an old friend. And so just gives you an idea of the kind of impact that these trips can have on you, and then certainly on me as a rail enthusiast and a young man in those times. But you'd walk through, and no matter what the car, the hallways were very narrow. So you always had this, and kind of like in the movie Silver Streak, you're walking through, and then somebody's going to be coming the other way, and sometimes that person is quite a bit bigger than you. And so you do this little awkward dance where, let's see, I'm gonna stand back, but then you're over here, you're gonna move back a few feet so I can get by because there's this one little area where we can pass and then keep going. So it was always a lot of fun, always made it very, very interesting. And then we would get to the dining car. And as someone who loved to eat and still loves to eat, the dining car was just, crazy for me. And what Amtrak did on those services is they didn't just have a single dining car where people went in and sat down. They actually had a cafeteria style, which is a lot like the Morrisons or the Piccadillys of that era. So you would come in, go through a line where somebody behind the counter would, ask what you want, and they put it on a plate, and then put that plate on the tray, bring that down to the cashier, which was at the end of the line. And the cashier would mark off that, your sleeping car room if you were in a sleeper, because then as now the dining car food was included with their ticket. Whereas for those of us in the coaches, and yes, I was a coach passenger with my grandmother, we would pay, and then another member of the dining car staff would carry our food, just kind of like in a regular restaurant, hold it up like this and everything, to our table. And that's where we would be seated with other travelers. One of the things I thought was really interesting about this was the split bottles of wine, and it was advertised that way in Amtrak's timetables. And I was like, what's a split bottle of wine? Well, it was a regular bottle of wine that looked like it had been cut in half, and a neck and cap or cork on each end. And so you could get these half bottles of wine, not small, but half bottles of wine, with your dinner if you were of age. And I always thought it was just the coolest thing because I'd seen bottles of wine before, but never these little mini split bottles of wine. So that was something that always stuck with me. And then, of course, while you were sitting and having dinner and chatting with people who were also seated at your table, where are they going? They want to know where you're going, and you always talk about something, your family or otherwise. But the interesting thing is it wasn't just topical, because if you think about it, when you're, for example, riding an elevator, you can have topical conversation. If you're sitting next to someone on an airplane, and you decide to make conversation, they make it with you, often it's very topical because everybody is always so guarded. But when you're having a meal, especially with people you don't know, especially on a voyage to a far off place, even if you know where the far off place is, it's so much different, and it was magical. And I loved it. And even as a kid, you know, you don't really want to be part of adults' conversation, and they don't want you to be part of their conversation. But it was different at the dinner table or lunch table or breakfast table aboard the dining car. And so that's one of the things I really enjoyed. And just to give you a little idea of what it was like inside, because up until 2015, 2016, Amtrak used the Heritage Fleet dining cars. And here's an example. I took this picture, I believe it was 2015 or 2016, right before they were finally phased out. And you could see that while a lot of the more glamorous type of seating that was used in the past had been removed, which were tables that were not fixed and chairs that were not fixed, the FRA, in one of its blunders, came along and decided that all the seats had to be fixed. So therefore, you ended up with these booths, which, you know, it works, but it certainly wasn't as restaurant feeling as or fine dining feeling as things had been in the past. But this is an example of what the table car section would look like. The upholstery on the booths was different. If I recall correctly, it was more of a salmon color when I was riding. But that gives you an idea of what it was like to sit down and eat. And you know, I've ripped Amtrak here, but I want to credit the staff on that train and the staff on a lot of the trains that I rode, especially in the 1980s, was very good, as I've said earlier, almost always helpful, nice. And one thing they had that they no longer do is the chief of onboard services, which were they had on the Silver Star and Silver Meteor. And it was always interesting because you get on the train, you don't have somebody who is head of customer service. You have the person in charge of the train, that's the conductor. You have the other T&E crew, the brakemen, of course, the engineer and the second engineer. If there is a second engineer, they'll be in the cab. And then you have various onboard service personnel, coach attendants, sleeping car attendants, dining car staff. But for a while, Amtrak had the chief of onboard services, and he or she was the head of customer service there. And so they would constantly be making announcements, helping to make sure the passengers are getting what they need, helping to make sure they feel good, managing the staff, and so on. And the train chiefs were great. So it was always cool to hear them paging over the or talking over the loudspeaker and really making it interesting and letting you as the customer know that there really was a commitment in, you know, in Graham Claytor's time to having a service that they as the company and you as the passenger could really be proud of. And as time goes on, we would just continue to travel and travel and travel. We would make our way up, if on the Silver Star, through Camden, Denmark, Columbia, Raleigh, and then getting over to Rocky Mount. So Rocky Mount before hitting the RF&P in Richmond, and then getting into Washington Union Station. And I want to make sure you have a chance to see, before we shut this down and sign off and get ready for 2024, what our trains look like when we went north of Washington. And what you see there is a General Electric E60, and you have that arrangement of the train that I talked about earlier: baggage dorm, coaches, sleepers, diners, more sleepers, more coaches, and of course lounges at either end of the group of sleepers. But that's what the trains would look like north of there. And in fact, that heavy consist is typical of what it would be like in the wintertime when so many people were traveling, including my grandmother and I. And then our trip would end right where Ricardo the Bull was running around a few weeks ago, and actually on the same track normally as where he was running around. Pull into Newark Penn Station, and we would detrain and go downstairs and either A, wait for the New Jersey Transit 76 bus that would take us to Hackensack, or we would, if we could do it, use the payphone and call my mother, my aunt, let them know that we had arrived, and they would drive over and pick us up. And not that the payphone was difficult to use, but remember, this was not the time when people were always by the phone, unless you had a job like being working on a railroad where you were always by the phone. So you weren't necessarily guaranteed that somebody was going to pick up. They could be taking a nap, they could be, taking a shower, whatever it is, and not quite there and ready to get your call. So sometimes if you didn't hear from them, you'd get on the bus and take that, and then you might try again when you're closer to the house if you had a lot of luggage. But that would be our trip on Amtrak and what it was like in the 1980s and how much fun I had enjoying that, and how a lot of the events that led to the formation of Amtrak ultimately influenced how I would end up traveling. So I hope you've enjoyed it. What I want you to do is in the comments, please share your thoughts on Amtrak's creation, the passenger rail problem of the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. And also, and I'd love to hear this more so than anything else, let me know about your experiences, whether you agree with me on some of my rants on Amtrak, you disagree with me. Tell me about your experiences, what it was like for you to ride the train, especially when you were younger, when things had more wonder and mystery and so forth, because I'd love to hear about that, and I'd love to compare what you have your experience with mine. And so either share them in the comments or shoot me an email at info at allaboard.media. Now, we are going to sign off. We're going to actually go out and do a little bit of train watching, get you some video and still pictures before the end of 2023, and get ready for tomorrow's episode, episode 9, where we're going to talk about trains that don't have any crews, don't have any couplers, and don't have any locomotives. And if you think that's strange, wait till you see it. So, thanks for being with us. Thank you for a great year, and we will see you on the main line.